Vital hoops is for the culture.
Peace, everybody. Welcome to the Vital Hoops podcast. My name is Fernando Cardenas, aka International XB. I'm your host. This is episode number 36, part 2 of our 3-part series for 50 years of hip hop. All right. If you listen to the Vital Hoops podcast, you know this by now, but when we talk about hip hop, we're not talking about commercial rap. We're not talking about only the rapping aspect. We're not talking about sales. Okay, we're talking about the culture. We're talking about hip hop culture. So celebrating 50 years of hip hop is important to us. You understand what I'm saying? And before we begin this episode, part 2 of this 3-part series, part 2, which is Cuban hip hop, I wanted to say this because I was talking to my brother, shout out to my brother Buba. And he was telling me, he's been, following the show, listening to the podcast. And, he was in New York in the 90s. He was in New York in the late 80s. You know what I'm saying? And he was very much so influenced by hip hop culture, by the culture itself. And he was telling me how, it's important to highlight, when we talk about the culture. And I agree with him 100%, the importance that, all the elements had, the cultural elements at the beginning when hip hop is born in 73 in the Bronx. You know what I mean? The graffiti, what graffiti did to the city, you know what I mean? To a city that was ravaged by poverty, by drugs, all this shit, all this oppression that the people were living. And, the light that graffiti brought to the city, you know what I'm saying? The combination between the MCs, the DJs, the B-boys, you know what I'm saying? And the graffiti, how important this was, you know what I'm saying, for the people. And this is why hip hop is a culture of the people, a culture of the community. You know what I mean? So I just wanted to highlight that point real quick, you know what I mean? And once again, shout out my brother. Because this is very important when we talking about, honoring the culture and honoring the pioneers of the culture. This is key. You know what I'm saying? Okay, so like I said, this is part 2 of our 3-part series here on Vital Hoops, celebrating 50 years of hip hop. And this one is Cuban hip hop, okay? We're honored to have our special guest today. He was there at the beginning in Havana when hip hop began. Our guest is one of, if not the first producer, the first hip hop producers in Cuba. He is definitely one of the most important ones. His contribution to the culture has been extremely important. He is an anthropologist with a PhD and a professor at the University of Toronto. I'm talking about none else than the great Pablo Herrera. Pablo Herrera, peace, my brother. How you doing? Welcome to the Vital Hoops
man,
podcast.
What's going on? All good. Thank you, man. Thank you for bringing me to the. Is it 3? I saw it said 340.
340 MS. Yeah, that's
actually.
Well, 340 MS is my hip hop group back in Cuba, but the podcast here is Vital Hoops. The podcast is Vital Hoops.
Yeah, man, that's amazing. Thank you so much for bringing me over. And have me on. I appreciate it.
Man, thank you.
Podcasts become a thing, no? It's become like sort of. I wouldn't say platform, but it's sort of a platform. It's like the sort of medium for people communicate.
No doubt. It's kind of our way our opportunity to, voice, spread our voice, in an independent way, but to me, it's very similar to my music, it's kind of like, you spreading a message. But the thing I like about podcasting is that, I can have a lot of people on, people who I feel are interesting and whose voice need to be heard. And I can, share with those people. So I appreciate you being here, man. I appreciate you being here.
I appreciate you inviting me, man. Thank you for that.
No doubt.
So we started talking. We're actually catching up. Just for people who are catching up, basically the conversation started with this idea that the character of the rapero, in Cuba or in Havana specifically, the guys who become raperos, MCs, they usually come from having their background is mostly for those who are most prominent. It's because they actually used to be
athletes, right?
Athletes, exactly. Yeah. So I was actually trying to figure out the word like alto rendimiento, but I don't know what would be that. Basically, high, like top athletes.
Yeah, top tier athletes. Yeah.
top tier, exactly. So most of them actually have been before, national champions. They've been to basically the top school of, just ready to go to the Olympics, or been to the Olympics already.
Right.
So that guy then becomes the MC in Cuba, right? In Havana, right?
Yeah.
And this is really interesting because it speaks, obviously we can have a very, really, a very long conversation about this, but then this kind of person that becomes the rapero, becomes the MC, then has all the stamina, all the bravado, all the impetus, the focus to draw not only one song, but just basically drive a whole career, right?
Right.
Produce, record after record. And then also have a following, which is also really important.
Yeah, no doubt, man. I think there's also the aspect of competitiveness, man, within an MC. An MC is somewhat competitive, and a lot of times we athletes, when you become an MC, you bring that with you, that competitive aspect, wanting to be the best. There's also a team aspect if you're in a team sport like me, like basketball. There's a team aspect, and I can always compare that to having a hip hop crew. Your group, your peoples. So
exactly.
I think, you know what I mean. So yeah, no doubt, man.
Exactly. It would be really interesting to ask ourselves, or ask the community, where do the women who joined hip hop come from, and what exactly is their background prior to becoming MCs themselves, right?
That's true.
Because I think and I've actually had that problem in the past, but I actually have tended to speak about the guys only.
We do that,
and I've sort of figure out not to speak about the women. I think the women, thinking from Instincto onwards, to Aituyi, Mariana, the two Janet, the one from Alamar, Janet from Creación Perfecta.
Yeah.
Obviously Magia.
Majority,
but I rather than majorities, I think majority is amazing, but I would talk about Crudas first. Crudas,
Crudas,
right?
no doubt. Crudas as
well. And Olaimar and Oliver, and then obviously the group of Nono and
man.
Ladies and Yari, all that whole group, and where did they come from, right? So I think this is sort of interesting. But going back again, and I'm just making that quick sort of parenthesis, going back to the idea of MCs being having this sort of formation as athletes. We start with Pando, who used to be a kayak champion in Cuba, through Papa Records, and I think just also wrestling, also athlete in Cuba, to Papi El Grande from 100%, who's also an athlete. But I think the really interesting case is one that's actually the most relevant Afro-Cuban, or actually Cuban rapper, Afro-Cuban rapper now outside of Cuba, which is Randy Acosta, who's actually, we don't know what kind of athlete he is. He's also an athlete.
I didn't know that.
He's a chess champion.
Chess? Wow.
Yeah, he went to chess school in Cuba.
Oh,
so this is, you see what I mean? Dope. So this is, so you see what I mean? Like the configuration, the mentality, the strategizing.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that makes sense.
I think this would be a whole. This
would be a whole different podcast, but it's interesting, no doubt. It's interesting, man.
Yeah.
So let's go back.
Let's get right into it.
First of all, let's shout out to all those great artists you just mentioned, man. Much respect. A lot of them are my brothers and sisters. I want to shout out to all of them, man. So no doubt.
Yeah.
But let's go back.
I should say before we go on, I forgot to mention Sexo Sentido.
Oh yeah, no doubt.
Right? Were from the start, they were part of the hip hop world, and right along everything. So they repped really hard since the beginning.
Well, I know that they didn't come from sports though, but they were right into music since they were very little.
Exactly. So Sylvia, your mother-in-law, she guided a lot of us.
Of course, I know.
To understanding how to do the music and how to basically, take on, Cuba's sort of cultural sphere. And so that's something that's super important.
Yeah,
mention that.
No doubt, man. Shout out to Mama Silvia. So listen, let's go back real quick, man. We're gonna get into everything, but so they understand a little bit the impact that that you brought to Cuban hip hop a little bit. Talk a little bit about yourself, man. You know, growing up, you know, where you grew up, how it was like, you know, for a black man growing up in Santo Suarez. We're talking, what, 80s,
No, we're talking about, I was born in
70s, 80s.
Parlaga. I
Uh-huh.
was born in Parlaga in 1960s, 1967.
Okay.
We come from a very poor Afro-Cuban background.
Mm.
My father's side, everyone was, my grandfather was a musician, and he made Afro-Cuban instruments.
Wow.
My dad's father, and then his mom, she was just a washing lady,
Okay.
lavandera.
Yeah.
We don't know the talents that this woman may have. All I know is that her trade was basically washing clothes.
Yeah.
And they lived in Parraga. This is where I was born, in Pinto, number 8 in Parraga. But then on my mom's side, her father was a construction contractor.
Okay.
In Havana, and they were 100% nation blacks. So these were 100% Igbo people living in Cuba.
Wow.
And I know this, but Igbo, I know
Yeah.
this because I am 62% Igbo. So if I'm 62% Igbo into 2023, that means that my grandfather was like, these guys were full.
Yeah, no doubt.
No mixture, 100% Igbo, etc. Right?
Yeah.
On my dad's family, they're a lot more mixed.
Okay. Yeah, I heard a little parenthesis. I heard there was still like a family in Matanzas. You know, my father was from Matanzas, but I heard there was a family in Matanzas that was still like, 100% like, they would speak the language and everything. I don't know if it was Igbo or maybe Yoruba, I don't know, but something. But there was
the people in Matanzas, and most of them, these people that you're talking about, they're all Arada.
Arara, probably, yeah, okay. Well, I heard there was like a tribe still living out there that had never, adapted to this Western culture, and they were still like, speaking native, and they were raising their children amongst themselves and everything. So that was pretty interesting.
It's likely. Yeah. So on her side, then, on my mom's side, then her dad is a construction contractor, and then her mom is it's like 8th generation, seventh or 8th generation Chinese black.
Okay.
So Havana, and she basically tailored and made hats, etc.
Okay.
And I think with the revolution and the opportunities that were provided by the Cuban government, then both of them became educated. My dad went on to become a radio electronics engineer, and then he became a doctor in engineering for the Cuban Navy, and then my mom was an architect for the public health sector.
Okay.
So I come from growing up in Santo Suarez, just the years later, I will be that one black kid who in my block, my parents will be probably the most educated people. So I couldn't, even though I do come from their background was poor, within this, after post 1959, even post 1970 something, I could not claim nothing else but middle class. So if you want to call it socialist middle class type of thing.
Right. Which was kind of like, can you kind of try to paint a picture for the audience? Because it's difficult for people to understand, kind of like what that was like.
Well, I mean, I could. I mean, I think even within my family, there's people who are basically higher up middle class, but that means that my parents will be the ones earning the most money in the block, or that my parents will be the ones who had both of them degrees in the same households, university degrees, right? And we're basically highly educated and leading intellectuals and leading professionals in their fields. This is what I mean. So so you don't have. I'm not saying that this is particular to me. Santo Suarez was the Mecca. I mean, we can go back and speak to Rosa Marchetti about in which ways Santo Suarez was not, continues to be a Mecca for Afro-Cuban music.
No doubt.
And when I say this, I'm claiming this based on.
Right? I don't know
Yo,
Now we can't see it right now. It's green screened.
there we go.
Oh yeah, there it is.
Yo, so
Celia and
she's
Cuba.
from Santos Suarez.
Word up, no doubt. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But then I also remember that Moises Simon, the guy who wrote The Peanut Vendor, lived in my block. His family lived in my block.
Wow. That's
You
crazy.
know, so this is so if we start making
Yeah.
those connections, not
Of
only
course.
that, the house that my mom actually got from got to live for us to live
Uh-huh.
was the used to be the house for Martha Young Claude, the Haitian artist or singer who lived
Yeah.
in Cuba for many years.
Mhm.
So this is what we're talking. This is the
No doubt.
ferment of culture that Santos Suarez is, and actually the one that I come out of, right?
Yeah, no
This
doubt.
sort of public culture, music.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's my background. Specifically, I
Okay.
think I need to go back to my grandfather on my dad's side to claim all sense of Afro-Cubanity or Afro-Cuban music coming from my house because he made the gorge, he made Chequerez at home.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. So
That's interesting, man. That's interesting.
and then on my mom's side, her brother was a rumbero, Eduardo Veitia,
Wow. Oh,
and
wow.
Tome Candela. Yeah. So yeah, man. The music.
So very artistic within the family already,
And then my dad started guitar for 7 years. So classic guitar.
Yeah.
So yeah, man. So
No doubt.
this is kind of
So talk to me a little about the beginnings of hip hop coming into Cuba and how you lived that and how you felt that and how hip hop became a part of your life.
I was actually writing about this. Something I don't know what my wife would probably say. Well, you need to push it and send it out. But like just talking about, I used to go to the parties in Santos Suarez with my friends in my block. 4-3 Tucci. We used to go to these parties. There's Santos Suarez is full of block parties and house parties.
Yeah.
And mostly before hip hop, it's like people listen to soul. I'm not gonna get into discussions of other music clubs, black music clubs across Havana.
Uh-huh.
But in Santos Suarez, there's a major craze of listening to from Earth, Wind and Fire to Whisper to all this different music that was amazing, right?
No doubt.
And most of this happened through listening to. And I need to shout out someone specifically, El Mito. Mito is one of those major DJs that were actually from Santos Suarez, and he had some sort of a sound system, and he would basically put it out of the balcony, he would play it out of his living room. But he lived in it's a tenement, but it has several stories, several floors. So he would be, I think, on the third floor or the top floor, and he would keep his music loud, playing it out of his house. And then
so people could hear it downstairs.
His door, I lived on the corner of Zapote y Ureje, so my corner was basically, would be basically
in alignment,
directly listening. So the good thing about this, and we can go into that or maybe for another time, but back then, Mito was getting recordings on cassettes from FM radio stations, specifically 99 Jams. Right?
Do you know how he was getting those? How he was getting them?
Listen, man, people have antennas. You have the antenna, you get it made, and then you get the antenna, you get recordings, you get
exactly, yeah.
But I also come from the family where my cousin Fidelito, back in Parra, when I was like, maybe a toddler or a little bit later, maybe 5 or 6, 7, maybe, he was listening to the W in Cuba, which is actually turned out later on to be the Voice of the Americas radio. And they would play, Mr. Postman, right? So, and also with Mr. Postman being a hit, you also get all the black music that was actually being broadcast.
Of course.
To Cuba, right? And then my cousin Muña, who I need to also shout out, his name is Rolando Hernandez Herrera. Muña will be picking up top 40, the top 40 Casey Kasem's show on AM since 1976.
Wow.
So this is people within this is my cousin, right? And so with this culture of music, the other person that becomes then important is my aunt Consuelo, and how she would bring music every time she came back to Cuba. She would have like this sort of cassettes and music. So I already have Mito in Santos Suarez playing music, so I'm up with it, all the new stuff, like, from James Ingram to, I forget this group. I think the group was ABC. They had a song called, it's like Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. It was like super amazing music that I could listen and like listen to my blog. But the one person actually I had the closest connection to the song Rapper's Delight
Wow.
was my aunt. She brought a tape from Spain, and
Okay.
it was the greatest hits. And
Right.
she brought, okay, I brought this, and then they had Rapper's Delight. When I listened to it, I was like, oh my God, what is
You were like, that's it right there.
this is it. I've actually told the story elsewhere,
Uh-huh.
and it's like this amazing song. So it was incredible to listen to that, and then obviously find my friends in boarding school who had also listened to Rappers Delight, but not only that, one of them had the actual Eighth Wonder cassette, which is the sophomore album after the Rappers Delight single, I think.
Okay.
They
Yeah.
had
Yeah.
Showdown, they had Eighth Wonder. These are like crazy tracks. You're like, what? So there's people like Chuck D talks about the surprise if anyone would want to actually put none of that stuff on record, and Grandmaster Flash and talks about also, like, we never imagined it. He's like, I didn't see it. I did not
Right.
see that this would be possible.
Right.
But
Right.
then Sylvia Robinson goes ahead and then she makes this record, and then we actually get introduced to hip hop.
Uh-huh.
But we get introduced to hip hop through Rappers Delight, which actually is a kind of like a complicated record because we know people have described it as a disco record with rapping on it.
Right.
Right? They bit cheeks, no? Good times, right?
Absolutely.
And then they had this guy's rapping stuff that had already been rapped by other people.
Uh-huh.
So it wasn't like even that original of a
Right.
record, but it did contain all the character of hip hop culture,
Yes.
borrowing they sort of their competitiveness, like I did it
Yeah.
first type of thing. So it was incredible.
No doubt.
So what I was saying is that I imagine that my experience with hip hop must have been similar to people in Guantanamo, people in Guanabacoa, people
Yeah.
in Dorado, having, this sort of bombardment, if you want to call it, of the music being around in some ways, mostly through radio, right? AM or FM, and having access to, American popular music. They also had hip hop in it.
Yeah.
Whatever became the first hits, like, Rappers Delight, et cetera, et cetera. So then you have also the Cuban government playing the music on TV, right? You had, Colorama, who would have like shows, or other shows that have, for example, Alejandro Zamora talks about how the Cuban government had them, this sort of, I forget, this event that's happened in South Africa where U2 and the Zulu Nation, I forget, Mbala, where in South Africa. I forget the name of that event. It's a major event that happened in South Africa a long time ago.
Okay.
So basically, you see sort of sprinkles of the culture coming out, because it was already big and it was basically being broadcasted to the world.
Yeah.
And so yeah, somehow I imagine that most people had access to it. I think the other big moment for the distribution of hip hop culture in Cuba was 1991 Pan American Games, where a lot of sports people came to Cuba with the music. So all the American basketball players, all the American sort of volleyball players and athletes who came to Cuba to participate in the Pan American Games, they
Right.
brought the music with them.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But then on top of that, let's leave the athletes and the actual moment. Let's talk about los marineros, the sailors, the black sailors, los marinos mercantes, no, the Merchant Marine staff who, in returning to Cuba, traditionally they were been bringing all the music from Commodores to War to
Yeah.
Gloria Gaynor, Donna Summer, and then they started bringing also hip hop as well, right?
Yeah.
So this is, we can go into that, but yeah. So I think that this is sort of a very punctual or specific way to understand how did hip hop got into Cuba. And then for me, later on, by the time I get to study at the University of Havana, I had already been studying some of the culture, specifically language and words, because I was into this is my thing. My first degree is in English literature and linguistics, and basically translation and interpreting.
Okay.
And I was interested in basically understanding how is it, the new sort of terms the new slang that was coming out of the culture. That was basically coming, street slang that was basically coming up with the culture. And then I was, I think I was telling someone else recently, Rebecca Bodenheimer, that there was words that would be used in American rap slang or hip hop slang that we also find in my neighborhood in Santos Juarez, which is crazy.
That is crazy.
So words like coyote ugly. I don't know if you ever heard that.
Yeah.
And those were used in Santos Juarez, like, so and so is a coyote,
Yeah.
So it's really crazy. So we can talk about this is the madness of the African diaspora. But we don't
that's
have
what
to
I
get
was gonna
into
say.
that.
This is kind of where the diaspora connects, and where actually we see that this is where we see that hip hop is an African culture, is a culture of the diaspora, of people of African descent. You know what I'm saying? So let's, so we're talking, we're in Cuba now, okay? We're in Cuba in we're in the 90s, maybe throughout like the special period, okay? Like el periodo especial hits. And now, just so that the listeners understand, when hip hop begins in Cuba, it's not like what it is today. Like it's a very Afro-centered, right? Very Afro-centered culture, just like it was in the States when it begins, right? So we're talking about,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'm not sure it was completely that when it first started in Havana.
Okay.
I would differ a little bit. I would say that it was just some people. Everyone was basically into it because it was the latest thing. But obviously there was like some black elements that were blacker and they're basically taken on by black youth in Havana, like the dancing.
Okay.
But you could say that, from Combate Directo to all these different sort of white guy groups that were already in Havana
We're
as
already a
well.
part of it. Okay.
You know what I mean? They're since the
no
beginning.
doubt.
And actually, if you think about, I forget his dad, the guys is one of Havana's most prominent dancers. He's a white kid.
Okay.
Not that. So we need to sort of take them on. I'm not talking about Cuerpo Roto. I'm talking about the guys who actually were started doing breakdancing. Forget his name now.
Yeah. Okay. I hear you. Okay. So, so wait, that's one interesting thing. Did breakdancing came in first before people started rapping, right?
Oh yeah, big time. So
people were b-boying.
So people were b-boying, but this is what I'm saying. The kind of stuff that I was talking about in Santos Juarez with Carlitos and guys from Guantanamo coming from people, dancers or breakers who will come from Guantanamo and knew the moves as much as people in Havana. You're like, how do you know? It's like, whoa, I have the naval base right next to me. So I got all the information, all the videos. Where you guys in Havana need to have a UHF antenna to be able to watch Soul Train or watch American Bandstand or whatever. I have it all right there next to us in Guantanamo Base, right? And so, but then again, the culture that we're talking about in Santos Juarez is a culture of Travolta, which is something that people never talk about, which is actually music or dance styles that come out of the disco era in Havana. Yeah. Specifically, Travolta, we need to talk about, I forget, it's Friday Night Live or Saturday Night Fever, that movie with John Travolta's in it.
Yeah, with John.
His name is used as a style, to name a style of the style of dancing in Havana that came prior to that, to breakdancing. The one thing that leads to breakdancing, Carlitos from Coco and those guys dancing in Santos Juarez is Travolta, right? So we need to sort of make sure that we understand that the culture came first through the dancing and then came MCing and then DJing and then producing.
So
I think DJing is actually the one thing that may have actually been there in its own sort of Cuban format based on resources that people had, because people didn't really have access to turntables to do two turntables. They had access to one turntable. And then they could record some vinyl, but most people had cassettes, right? So people like Emito, people like Alberto P, people like Alberto Jimenez Chacon, people like Randel from Piragua, people like those guys. Those guys use cassettes. So there's a whole culture of cassette use.
Yeah.
If you want to go back, even the people from the soul and jazz clubs in Santa Amalia and Barrio Azul, those guys had cassettes. And what they listened when they had the clubs listening to the club of soul, the club of jazz.
For sure.
Those guys, that's all cassette DJ, right?
Yeah, no doubt. Even when I started recording, we were still, we were on cassettes. So we had to kind of try to record the whole track. You couldn't mess up. You were on the cassette, and if you messed up, you had to start all the way from
You had to start all over again, man.
So you had
all
to
over
rap.
Again.
You really had to
Not
go
even
through.
that. Not even that. When you actually, I would go with my aunt to the beach, and there's my aunt's stereo, and I was basically, well, I don't even know. It was like 1970 something. So I'm like really young. I'm with my cousins. This is their stereo. I'm not supposed to touch it.
Right.
But I'm like, I need to record this stuff. Like, how am I going to do it? So here I am sitting there, not going to the water, waiting for the song to come on because I know that this is on rotation. So they're going to play that song again.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting there, like, probably you eat some food or something. I'm like just sitting here waiting for the music to go on again. So, and then obviously, if I have a chance, be able to record it as well. So I think something important about this issue, the mechanics of being able to listen to music and capture it, record it, came also with the issue of being at my aunt's house with her stereo that she brought from Europe in the late 1970s. It was like no one had a stereo like that. And I'm sitting there in front of the stereo, rewinding, and she's like, "You cannot do that to that. Like, you need to get out of that corner. Stop touching."
Right.
You see what I mean? So,
no doubt.
It's funny.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay, so as far as the MCs, right? When the MCs started in Cuba, a lot of what we were talking about, a lot of what they were talking about at the time was what Black people were going through. Sometimes they would get a lot into racism. They would get a lot into the police, right? How they were treated in everyday life.
Yeah, again, right off, we need to continue. Go back to like before Iraq rise at the Val de la Esquina, and before even when Primera Base records Igual que tú in 1996, right? Which are actually Afrocentric, Afro-conscious or Black-centric, Black-conscious songs. There's this aspect of mimetism that we need to address, which is the people were repeating what they were seeing. The Afrocentricity that we were sharing in our songs in Rap Cubano was basically repeating the pattern that was coming out of, the message. Out of those songs. Obviously, the message is much older. It's like, 1982. But we need to understand that even though all those music, we're still not addressing Cuba's racism in Cuban terms, so Afro-Cuban terms.
So okay, right? When do you think that started though? When do you think?
I mean, definitely you can definitely say, and I will correct what I've said before, that I would say Igual que tú is probably perhaps the first song that addresses the issue of racism directly.
Okay,
with Primera Bases or Ruben Marin's affiliation or aligning himself with Malcolm, right?
Yeah, no doubt.
But I think that I would say in 1996, Achabón Cruzado by Joel Pando then becomes a song that addresses the issue of racism and racial mixture and mestizaje and being not even black or white, which is something that it has to do with the matter of Cuba and Cuban society. The issue of not being black and white, which actually is problematic. It's
because colorism that comes in. Colorism comes in, and
Yeah, but I mean, like, it's perhaps the first song that actually addresses the issue of racism in Cuba.
Yeah.
In Cuban terms.
Yeah.
I'm not taking away nothing from Igual que tú, but Igual que tú has the issue that they, I don't have to go into that. It has some issues that it basically addresses the issue of blackness from a perspective that basically is distorted based on what you actually hear on the radio. So specifically the fact that he uses the N-word to refer to that he wants to be an N-word like Malcolm.
Right.
And he's like, well, African Americans, this is what we remember, Board Stiff was in Havana at a show, and there was, Primera Base, Amenaza, all the people performing, and then when Primera Base came on, there was all these people from California there, and also some expats that lived in Cuba, lived in Havana, and when they heard, it was like, okay, these guys are talking about Malcolm, but like, wait a minute, you cannot talk about Malcolm and then use the N-word in the same sentence.
Yeah, because there's a disconnect with the language.
Yeah. So I think that this will be the problematic part about this issue of mimetism, where you're repeating what you have, what you hear, but you're not really addressing it with your own terms. Actually, is what happens later on.
No doubt.
From Achabón Cruzado onwards.
but I do feel like the way it connected, or the reason it connected so much, partially was because of this African diaspora thing. I said that I think that we share, like, even though the African Americans were living their the way they were living their lives, and their oppression and everything that was going on over there was very different from what we were living, from what Afro-Cubans were living in Cuba. There was still a connection there. There was still a
Oh, for
connection
sure.
there. And I
For
feel
sure,
like,
for sure.
and I feel like that's what made it so relatable. That's what made hip hop, so natural to us. So I think
Yeah, I
that's,
mean, this is something that I'm talking about, and this thing that I'm trying to talk about for this hip hop 50th anniversary. And this issue what I'm saying is that a lot of the reason why we're so keen to be part of the culture is because we were born to be the culture, right?
no doubt.
It's not the African American sent it to us, and we somehow caught it and like, oh, we received it. Because it's like seeing this, continuing to see hip hop as something that's hierarchical. We can get into hierarchies within hip hop and royalties, et cetera, but you have to see it as a wave that has multiple flanks, and it's coming out of the diaspora itself. It's not just something that happens only. I mean, otherwise you wouldn't have Instinto,
Of course.
not knowing any English, performing. You wouldn't have Pando being a Kayake, in Havana, and then somehow becoming the best rapper in Cuba. How? Is it just by imitation? How do you become hip hop if you're not hip hop yourself?
Exactly. Yep.
Right. So, and then I'm actually making the case of how that press, when they were in Havana and they performed is bigger than hip hop.
Yeah.
They had this slideshow with all this sort of lots of images of Black people and sort of get free, fight for your freedom situations, right? And how the impact of that for people in groups like Anonimo Consejo, groups like Junior Clan, me, and Emmanuel Gauss, and all, like the crazy impact. But what we actually failed to see in the case of the press, they came in 2001. That means that Common Sense had already been in Cuba. That means that Black Star and M1 had already been in Cuba in 1998.
Right.
And Erica had been to Cuba kind of sideways a little bit through Common, because I think they were dating back then. And so what we actually failed to see is that what brings them to Cuba is not that they're coming to perform, is that the wave is also starting in Havana. It's also coming out of Havana, right? So they come to witness the wave from a different angle.
Right.
The wave that brought them to Cuba comes from also a different angle. And I think the best way to explain it is, I don't know if you know the work of just a guy named Jarvis Givens. He's a professor of education at Harvard. He talks about the work of Carter G. Woodson. You know Carter G. Woodson?
Yeah, of course.
So obviously Carter G. Woodson talks about fugitive pedagogy, right? And these teachings, these tools that you get while you're in the classroom, you're reading something else that's not what you're being taught by the professor. So in a sense, what I'm trying to say is that we must apply this idea of fugitive education, fugitive pedagogy, the tools that come with it. There actually are mostly sensorial, mostly nonverbal tools about freedom and about the practice of freedom. They come in the grain of hip hop, even in a song like Rappers Delight. Right? So even as a product as front as Rappers Delight has the culture and those tools in it. So when it gets to Havana, you're like, wait, I understand exactly. I don't need to understand the English. I'm as a Black person, I get the message. I don't. You don't need to translate it, bro. I get you.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
I feel you. That's
exactly. Yeah. I feel you. That's the right word. So I think that we need to see hip hop as that, hip hop culture as access to those tools for the practice of freedom and contesting power, right? That I think this is really what hip hop is about, and it's about waking up, or actually, creating this sort of network of connections. Where when Dilla, in Survival Tests, he has it, how you feel out there. That question is not for Detroit only.
Right.
That question is not for New York. That question is not just for LA. That question is also for Havana. Of
course.
Right. That question is also for Mogadishu. The question is for Soweto. The question is and then those other areas and locales reply with our own form. Yeah. Now the problem here is that because of power, people in the United States tend to not see or not be ready to receive the reply. You get what I mean?
Yeah, of course.
Or not be able to recognize the reply
Mm.
and acknowledge it
Mm.
and value it, right?
Mm.
Because you come when you show up in Havana, which is the case of the Roots, and I have to say it, members of the Roots, in Havana, being touring, at the time the Roots is touring, doing 200 and something concerts a year, which is an incredible amount of concerts. They arrive in Havana and they behave in Havana like they are in Paris.
Okay, yeah, they didn't.
Like
They
they
didn't
are
connect.
like that. They don't. I don't think they. I think Tariq. I think they're not Tariq. Tariq
Quest.
got it. Questlove got it. I'm sure he got it.
Okay.
But I believe other members of the crew may have not gotten it.
Okay.
You just start screaming, "Where's the bathroom?" In the middle of you lose it, where you can actually ask people, "Where's the bathroom?" and you can be led to the bathroom.
Mm.
And I think he knows who I'm talking about. He knows himself. If he gets to, I don't think he gets to see the show. And
Hopefully he does.
it's not Questlove. I'm talking about another member of the band.
Yeah, I hear you.
Misbehaving in Havana means that you don't. Not only that, we've talked about this. That press missing the possibility of being on national television in Cuba.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, missing it because they were tired.
Okay.
If you're bringing dollars in New York City on stage, you get to Havana and you don't go to national television.
Yeah.
The process of being within the United States and the culture there, I understand that there's many dynamics. But something that we can critique is the fact that you cannot see horizontally, and hip hop is about seeing and speaking horizontally.
Yeah.
Right. And then if you fail to recognize the reply and fail to recognize the other flanks of that wave that you started or that you actually are part of, how can we talk about Pan-Africanism? How can we talk about you follow the work of W.E. Du Bois?
Exactly.
We're talking about this is not about
it has to be a two-way conversation. We have to be able to understand each other.
It has always been a two-way conversation.
Yeah.
It's never been just uppercase conversations only, and then if you're lowercase,
no.
If you're not part of the talented 10th, then you're not.
That's not hip hop. That's not hip hop.
No, but wait, Pan-Africanism started with the talented 10th.
Well, Pan-Africanism.
Sorry.
It's
at least the practice of it, some of it started. I'm sure I probably mistake. People will say, well, talking about Booker T. Washington, we're talking about Marcus Garvey, and all their iterations of Pan-Africanism. I'm sure that we can talk about lowercase actually Black
because it's a movement. It's a movement for the bottom. A lot of most Pan-Africanist historians, and I agree with this, will tell you that Pan-Africanism started when the first brother that rebelled, or maybe the Haitian Revolution. You know what I mean? The Haitian Revolution is like the first act of Pan-Africanism. You know what I'm saying? So you know what I mean? But yeah, that's a whole nother discussion too.
we can get into it. No problem. We can get into it. But
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to play sort of some nuggets of criticism to some perspectives that actually have been damning and damaging to. I also praise the work of Black August bringing the culture. And
I wanted to get into that a little bit.
Participate, and facilitate resources and amazing stuff. But at the same time, in other angles, because all of it is, if it is a horizontal effort, it can not only be just a group of people only. It needs to be all of us, right? At least most people.
Of course.
And so that's something. I think I'm gonna try to jump into. Let's jump to. I think Black August was important, specifically with this highlight of Afrocentric perspectives and Afrocentric perspectives. In politicization of hip hop in Cuba, especially Black hip hop. It met a match, not because, like Jeff Baker talks about, they imported race conversations and race discussions, so issues raising to Cuba. It's just that we were actually in the midst of figuring out that main problem ourselves. So it's like, I see that these are the tools. I can use those tools to engage the problem that I see here with myself, the police stopping me in the street. So it's not just something that came out of, we in Havana had our own issues, right? So,
Absolutely.
and
And
people
that's where I
asking,
feel like sometimes there was also somewhat of a political disconnect, you know.
what do you mean?
I mean, like, I feel like sometimes it still happens today, there might be a political disconnect where certain black people mainly from the United States or other places come to Cuba with a specific political idea, you know what I'm saying, in their head, because
Agenda, it's called agenda, it's an agenda.
right, because we understand that the United States is the belly of the beast, so they're living what they're living over there. Okay, so once they come to Cuba, they see Cuba as a paradise due to the revolution, right? And so sometimes there's certain harsh realities that our people, that people of African descent in Cuba are living, that these people don't necessarily understand, or they don't want to face, or they want to act like they don't understand, or they want to act because they have the idealism of the Cuban Revolution.
Yeah, but important here with the Cuban Revolution, and I think that for a lot of people, including African Americans and people, oppressed people across the world,
right?
And we talk about the London Line movement, the Bandung Conference, et cetera, and et cetera, and et cetera. The reality and the accomplishment of the Cuban Revolution is something that's of the utmost importance, because it's something they had not done before, and it had not happened clearly before. The Vietnam War happens, it happens after 1959.
Yeah,
right? I'm not claiming any special exceptionalism for Cuba, but Cuba becomes that symbol of the first sort of, like Haiti, the first sort of revolution that becomes then a successful attempt at reading yourself out of the grasp of American imperialism. So when people think and think through it, specifically I'm talking about Caribbean people like Walter Rodney and other Caribbean scholars, Brian Meeks, etc., who have actually seen Cuba as like this mecca or this sort of amazing issue. That what they don't see is that Fidel Castro does not symbolize Black people in Cuba or our struggle. Right? Absolutely. So yeah, the revolution did give my parents and my generation a lot. Yeah. But then they didn't. Their agenda was not to solve the issue of racism or anti-Blackness. That's in the grain of Cuban culture, right? Yeah. Absolutely. So when we get to the point where the country falls into an economic crisis, we go all the way back to 1912.
Yeah, our people are at the bottom. Yeah.
No. I mean, the idea of the bottom, we can talk about Taliban, but the actual tipping, it's already been there. That the possibility inside 1959, and the possibility that Cuba will be a horizontal, non-racial society, was again, posited by Guillen Stengel poem, right, 1964. Yeah. Let's see. He says, "Vamos a ver." Let's see if this happens. Right. It seems like now it's all going to be good. When the revolution happened, how is it that Walter Rodney talks about Cuba and he's like, we need to Jamaica, but they failed to see that the revolution was not really addressing the issue of Blackness. There's a book by several books, but I think I will read out talk about the Marquis Sawyer's book.
Yeah, I think by default it helped us. It helped our people by default.
No, for sure. I mean, for sure, it helped a lot of people.
It helped our people without a doubt.
Yeah, but it wasn't only. It wasn't only to help all of us. It helped Vietnamese people. It helped people in Nicaragua. It helped people in Argentina. It helped because it was the one successful anti-imperialist effort, right? That actually did happen. For sure. But in the core of it, the actual revolution, Cuban Revolution is not. It's actually a sovereign, an independence movement, right? This is what they're really about. It's about being independent, being able to do whatever you want with the country without having any big power deciding for you. Right. That does not mean that this is about Black people or about Afro-Cubans and our struggle and our issues, right? Yeah. And so without just going too far, this idea of this sort of balance that starts with the idea that Cuba could be a non-racial society after 1959, and Guillen's poem in 1964, we have in 2001, Hermanos de Causa revisit Guillen to say, yo, Tango, 2001, I cannot go into hotels.
Absolutely.
Police stopping me.
Absolutely.
What's going on?
That's a reality that, yeah.
So then Afro-Cuban rap becomes this specific site of the poetics of protest.
Mm-hmm.
It's perhaps the best way to tread or find what happens, right? We I don't know how much time we have. We can, following Hermanos de Causas tango in 2001, we can go directly back to not only the many other tangos that have been written, we can go straight back to 2019 when Wow Poppy and Poppy La Moda reparto rappers.
Okay.
Because this is also Afro-Cuban rap.
Yeah.
Reparto rappers in 2019, they revisit tango. And they're saying, I don't need y'all to help me. I got my Louis Vuitton. I got all the shoes and everything I need. I don't need y'all to help me. I'm not waiting for y'all to let me get into the hotel anymore.
Okay. Do you want to do a book recommendation? Did you have one?
Book recommendations. I will start with, like I said, look him up. Mark Hugh Sawyer.
Okay.
Antiracism Cuba, Devyn Benson.
I will have the links.
Look up Tanya Saunders' Cuban hip hop underground movement. This is 2015. Look, Mark Perry's Soy Negro Soy Yo. And then I highly recommend looking for Professors Ada Ferrer's Cuba and American History. Yeah.
Okay.
There's many. You can talk about the work of Odette Casamayor. You can talk about, so many different people. I would highly recommend reading again and then revisiting The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James.
Absolutely.
The edition of 1963, read the appendix where it says Cuba is page 411. Page 411, the Black Jacobin says Cuba is the most West Indian island in the West Indies. So,
wow. And
we're just waking up to the Caribbean, right? So that means that we need to understand that we're the biggest island in the Caribbean.
Okay.
And, whatever's happening in Cuba has already been happening. I think we need to follow the examples of Black people. If we want to actually understand some of the stuff, we need to read David Scott.
Okay.
And specifically, his discussion of, his desires of, what could happen in Jamaica with socialism, with the Manley administration, and his frustration that didn't happen. And we should think also about the case of Guyana and socialism in Grenada with Morris Bishop, and how Cuba is part of that, right? That kind of conversation. But yeah, man.
I appreciate you, man. Thank you very much. I'm gonna have some info down, and hopefully we'll have you back, man, on the Vital Hoops podcast. Thank you, brother. Peace.
Salute, man.
Peace.
Yeah, peace.
All right. Part 2 of this 3-part series is in the books, celebrating 50 years of hip hop. This was Cuban hip hop with the brother Pablo Herrera. Again, much respect to Pablo Herrera. Thank you very much for being on the show. And thank you, the listeners, for checking us out. You know what I'm saying? Please, this is a listeners-sponsored podcast. You know what I'm saying? I'm not asking you to send us money. All I'm asking you to do is, if you appreciated some of it or all of it, please share it. Share it with your friends. Share it with your enemies. You know what I'm saying? Subscribe to the podcast. You can even hit us up, vitalhoopspodcast@gmail.com, if you have any suggestions, any things you would like to see on the show, any guests, you know what I mean? And we are on social media at Vital Hoops Podcast. You can definitely go to vitalhoops.net and see what we got going on. But Pablo Herrera had, a lot of jewels, you know what I mean? So make sure you listen to it again. Okay, I'm gonna have some important links. Pablo recommended a lot of good books. I'm gonna put a couple there, a couple book recommendations are gonna be down in the description as always. Also, I will have some videos, some Cuban hip hop videos on there. A few that Pablo Herrera produced, that I feel like are very key, important when we're talking about Cuban hip hop history, you know what I mean? And I will also, I might have a couple from my group, 340 MS, you know what I'm saying? We give thanks to those who came before us, you know what I'm saying? We're inspired, by Pablo Herrera and all those great artists that he worked with before we came through, and they're still working. You know what I'm saying? A lot of them are my brothers and my comrades. So shout out once again, like I said, shout out to everybody who is involved in hip hop culture, no matter where you at, in a positive way, not the culture vultures. You know, shout out to the people who live the culture. Shout out to the people who support the culture. And yeah, I appreciate you all. Vado Hoops is for the culture. Peace.